Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to this special UCL Lunch Hour lecture, which is part of an annual series marking Holocaust Memorial Day. For this Holocaust Memorial Day 2025, the lecture is entitled Voicing the Destruction of European Jewry, Yiddish and the Holocaust. My name is Lily Khan. I'm professor of Hebrew and Jewish languages and head of Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at UCL. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, my colleague, Dr. Sonia Gollance. Dr. Gollance is Associate Professor of Yiddish Studies at UCL. She's a scholar of Yiddish Studies and German Jewish literature, whose work focuses on dance, theater, and gender. Her first book, It Could Lead to Dancing, Mixed Sex Dancing in Jewish Modernity, was published by Stanford University Press in May 2021. A National Jewish Book Awards finalist and winner of a Choice Award for Outstanding Academic Title, this book was released in paperback in October 2023. Previously, she taught at the University of Vienna, the Ohio State University, and the University of Göttingen. Gollance serves on the editorial board of InGeweb, a journal of Jewish studies, the British and Irish Association for Jewish Studies Committee, and the Institute for Polish Jewish Studies Advisory Board. Before we begin, I just wanted to let you know that we will have some time at the end of the lecture for questions, and that these can be submitted at any point during the talk by going to Slido, sli.do. Just enter that into your internet browser and enter the event code #voice. We'll only be putting through questions that are related to the topic of this lecture. So I'll now hand over to Dr. Gollance for her talk.
Thank you, Professor Khan, for the kind introduction. Holocaust Memorial Day 2025 marks the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. On the 27th of January, 1945, Soviet troops entered the largest German camp complex and encountered thousands of emaciated, dehumanized survivors. They were the last remnant of the almost 1.5 million people who had been imprisoned and systematically murdered within the confines of Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945. Of the astronomically large number of people who perished in Auschwitz, over 90% were Jewish. Roughly a quarter of all the Jews murdered in the Holocaust were killed in the Birkenau Killing Center, part of the Auschwitz camp complex. By linking Holocaust Memorial Day with the liberation of Auschwitz, we recognize how the Allies saved Europe from fascism and rescued what was left of Hitler's victims. We can imagine the victorious, horrified soldiers encountering piles of dead bodies and survivors whose suffering was so extreme they seemed barely human. Jews commemorate the Holocaust on a different day. Yom HaShoah marks the anniversary of the largest Jewish uprising against the Nazis during the Holocaust. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was an armed insurgency by Jews imprisoned in the Warsaw Ghetto who knew they faced the options of deportation and almost certain death in the Treblinka Killing Center, or rebellion and almost certain death. The roughly 700 ghetto fighters were young people who had no good options, no choice that guaranteed their survival. They timed the uprising and their deaths as martyrs with the holiday of Passover, the Jewish festival of freedom, the holiday of liberation from bondage in Europe. The name of the Jewish Holocaust Memorial Day, Yom HaShoah, is in Hebrew. The choice to focus on Jewish armed resistance to the Nazis reflects a desire by post-war Jews and the young state of Israel to valorize Jewish fighters instead of focusing on Jewish victimhood. This is rather different from focusing on the liberation of Auschwitz. But for me, as the only full-time permanent lecturer in Yiddish in the United Kingdom, every day is Holocaust Memorial Day. The word for the Holocaust in Yiddish is korban, a word which means destruction. This same word is used to talk about the destructions of the first and second temples in Jerusalem in ancient times, events which caused a paradigmatic shift in Jewish religious practice as Judaism became a religion practiced by people in exile. It is virtually impossible to engage with the richness of Yiddish civilization and not be harshly reminded of what we have lost in this 20th century korban, this 20th century destruction. Many of my students find Yiddish compelling because learning this language lets us into a vanished world and helps us try, in some small measure, to right a historical injustice. From at least the early modern period up until the mid-20th century, Yiddish was the most commonly spoken Jewish language. Jews across Europe lived their lives in Yiddish, and by the 20th century, Yiddish speakers had migrated to places as far-flung as North and South America, South Africa, Azerbaijan, and Australia. Yiddish was the language in which they wrote secular epics, women's prayers, melodramatic plays, newspaper reportage, religious parables, modernist poetry, and socialist pamphlets. On the eve of World War II, over 10 million people spoke Yiddish, which is about the same number of people as speak Swedish today. And then, over the course of 12 years, between 1933 and 1945, this number was cut in half. More specifically, most of the Jews murdered in the Holocaust were killed between 1941 and 1944. In less than 4 years, the majority of the Jews in the Yiddish heartland of Eastern Europe were wiped out. Approximately 5 million of the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust spoke Yiddish. I'll say it again. 5 out of 6 Jews killed in the Holocaust were Yiddish speakers. Yiddish is not only about the Holocaust. I would be remiss if I left you with that impression. It is a language and literature that developed for centuries, and there is something perverse about only focusing on the whole-scale destruction of the people and cultural milieu that helped it flourish. But Yiddish is also not about the Holocaust. The fate of Yiddish was shaped by the Holocaust. Our thinking about Yiddish today includes knowledge of this terrible coda to the chapters that had existed before. And most importantly for us today, in the context of this talk, the vast majority of Jews who suffered through the Holocaust made sense of this catastrophe in Yiddish, narrated their experiences in Yiddish, and engaged in intellectual resistance in Yiddish. I realize that there are a variety of different types of Holocaust memorial events that might reflect the needs of specific sites or particular communities. But speaking generally, if you're commemorating the Holocaust and you don't include Yiddish, then you are missing out on the opportunity to incorporate the voices of the majority of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. And in doing so, take a stand against them being silenced. Now, I realize that this might sound somewhat harsh, and the idea of my thinking of the Holocaust every day as I teach the bright young minds at UCL might strike you as somewhat grim. As it happens, I know of more of my ancestors who served in the United States military during World War II than I know of relatives who died in the Holocaust. Like many of you, I do feel that burst of personal pride when thinking of the Allies liberating the camps. My Yiddish-speaking ancestors were fortunate that they could immigrate to the United States as economic migrants by 1924, and I have cherished the country of my birth as the place that offered them refuge before it became obvious that this refuge was necessary. Yet the Gollance branch of my family, the one that gave me my surname, first came to Manchester. And I regard it as a tremendous privilege that UCL has given me the opportunity to work in the country where my great-grandfather was born and teach his heritage language. So yes, the Holocaust casts a shadow on my classroom because the Yiddish world has never recovered from the years of destruction. But my classes are also a place of joy and purpose where we get to immerse ourselves in the centuries of Yiddish creation. In the rest of my talk today, I'm first going to explain what Yiddish is and sketch out its importance for understanding pre-war Jewish civilization. Then I'll address the vital significance of Yiddish for Holocaust research by walking you through a few examples of Yiddish literary texts written during or shortly after the Holocaust. I've specifically chosen texts that emphasize the importance of the written word as a way of resisting the destruction of European Jewry. And I'll focus on a Yiddish play that I am currently translating into English. Finally, I'll conclude with a pitch to you to engage with Yiddish language and culture this year, and I'll give you a bunch of examples of ways to do so. Like English, Yiddish is a fusion language. Speaking very approximately, it is about 60% medieval German, about 20% Hebrew and Aramaic, so a Semitic component, about 15% Slavic loanwords, a lot of them from Polish, and also some bits from medieval Romance languages, like medieval French and medieval Italian. Although the exact components vary according to place and dialect. So for instance, a Yiddish song about immigrant life in the United States could refer to a female next-door neighbor using the word nextdorke, adding a Slavic feminine ending to the English words next door. So female next-door neighbor, nextdorke. Yiddish originated in the Middle Ages, probably in the Rhineland region of Western Germany, or perhaps further east near the Danube River. The fact that Yiddish is so closely related to German suggests that there were lots of interactions between Jews and their German-speaking neighbors, although Yiddish is written in the Hebrew alphabet, as is typical for Jewish languages. The word Yiddish itself means Jewish, since it was the language spoken by Yidden, which is the Yiddish word for Jews. Of course, not all Jews spoke Yiddish. Historically, Jews in various communities and various places have spoken over a dozen different vernacular languages, including Ladino, Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Italian, and Judeo-Tat. You can study many of these languages online through the Oxford School of Rare Jewish Languages. Yet, until the development of modern Hebrew, Yiddish had, for centuries, by far the largest number of speakers. Yiddish was spoken by the Jews who lived in medieval German lands and their descendants, which is to say, Ashkenazi Jews. Yet the word Yiddish wasn't used for the language until the early 20th century. Instead, other terms were used, which give us different perspectives on the attitudes Yiddish speakers had for their own vernacular language. It could be called Teich, derived from the German Deutsch, which suggests the translation of sacred texts into a Germanic vernacular. And in a provocative new book, Saul Zaret has suggested that we return to this term. The language could also be referred to as Mamaloschen, which means mother tongue, or even dubbed jargon, a corrupt jargon rather than a fully fledged language. As these terms indicate, Yiddish could be a pragmatic tongue, a vehicle for translation, an intimate language of the home, or a reminder of Jewish difference that for many felt increasingly awkward as Jews received more opportunities to acculturate into European majority cultures. By about 1800, Jews in Western Europe had stopped speaking Yiddish to their children, and Western Yiddish died out within a few generations, even as Yiddish continued to flourish in Eastern Europe. Throughout the centuries, Yiddish was regarded as the language of the common people, suitable for literature read by women and by men who were not part of the scholarly elite, in contrast to the Hebrew and Aramaic sacred texts that better educated men were meant to be studying. Yiddish was not generally held in high esteem. It was a workhorse of a language used for the kitchen, market, and popular literature. It did not have the same prestige as the languages which were used for most Jewish holy books, such as the Torah and Talmud. And it was not considered a language of culture like German, French, or Russian. In fact, in the early years of the Soviet Union, Yiddish was embraced as the language of the Jewish working masses, until authorities decided that speaking Russian would be even better. While I enjoy pointing out to students that Yiddish holds the traces of Jewish migration history and language contact between different cultures, in periods of nationalism, its linguistic hybridity and the belated standardization of its grammar were marks against Yiddish. Attitudes towards Yiddish reflected attitudes towards the Jews who spoke the language, and the people who disparaged Yiddish as a corrupt jargon often also felt that Jews needed to improve themselves. And in many cases, the people who held these views were Jewish themselves. True, Yiddish was a useful tool for expressing the spirituality of ordinary Jews, whether through vernacular prayers or Hasidic folk tales. And it was also the best way to mobilize the Jewish working masses, whether to encourage them to embrace socialism or to polemicize against the perceived evils of arranged marriages. There were always practical uses for Yiddish. Yet only in the second half of the 19th century did Jewish intellectuals make a concerted effort to raise the status of Yiddish and transform Yiddish into a world literature like other world literatures. They established a Yiddish literary canon, developed a standardized grammar, built Yiddish schools, and campaigned against the popularity of trashy melodramas. And just as Yiddish literature was experiencing a second or third generation of literary modernists, this rich, idealistic, intellectual milieu was annihilated, like so many of its authors. Many of the same writers who contributed to the flourishing of modern Yiddish literature had to grapple with the destruction of their entire culture. They often wrote about this destruction in works of intellectual resistance that helped them demonstrate their continued humanity in the face of Nazi degradation. This is not to say that the sudden, dramatic decrease in Yiddish speakers worldwide was only due to the Holocaust. Jews were encouraged to speak English in the United Kingdom and United States. The State of Israel promoted Hebrew over Yiddish, and the Soviet Union went from embracing Yiddish to purging Yiddish writers. But the Holocaust undeniably marked a crucial and tragic turning point for Yiddish. In short, The history of Yiddish literature is not just a chronicle of literary works, literary movements, and authors. It is also a history of how people have viewed Yiddish, Yiddish speakers, and Yiddish literature. Writers could choose to take such assumptions as a given, to challenge conventional views of Yiddish literature, or to use these attitudes towards Yiddish literature as a trope that could add texture to a given work. And in the case of Yiddish literature about the Holocaust, this language takes on the sacred task of commemorating a people and civilization that the Nazis tried so hard to wipe off the face of the earth. Scholars of Yiddish literature write about the impact of the Holocaust on Yiddish in different ways. In her book, Discovering Exile, Anita Norwich argues that for American Yiddish writers, the Holocaust represented a more profound sense of being in exile than they had ever before experienced. They were unable to return to their hometowns in Eastern Europe, and then the communities and the people themselves were destroyed. In traditional Jewish religious thought, the years of exile will end with redemption and return to Zion. Yet for American Yiddish writers confronting the Holocaust, there would be no redemption from this irrevocable destruction. Other scholars have focused on the Yiddish language as a vehicle for intellectual projects during these tragic, turbulent years, such as Barry Trachtenberg's study of the Allgemeine Encyclopedia, the multi-volume Yiddish language general encyclopedia that was started in 1930s Berlin, continued in 1930s Paris, and concluded in 1960s New York. Even more recently, Hannah Polin-Galai has examined the impact of the Holocaust on the Yiddish language itself in her book, Occupied Words, which considers why survivors might respond to the Holocaust by writing a dictionary of new vocabulary that came into use during this catastrophe. I'd also like to encourage us to think about the importance of the Yiddish language, specifically focusing on how Yiddish was used as a conscious tool for intellectual resistance. In other words, even when people had no good choices and little chance at survival, writing in Yiddish could be an act of bravery and a demonstration of their continued humanity. One of my favorite examples of intellectual resistance to discuss with students is the Oinik Shabbos Archive, a secret underground archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. This was an effort by historian Emanuel Ringelblum to document life in the Warsaw Ghetto so that the Nazi version of events wouldn't be the only narrative. It was an extremely risky undertaking, and ultimately, only 3 of the several dozen people involved survived the Holocaust. The materials were buried underground before the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and 2 of the 3 containers were recovered after the war. They contain a wealth of materials, including documents, drawings, photographs, ration cards, German posters announcing deportation, and literary texts. One of these pieces is Leib Golden's Chronicle of a Single Day, Chronik von a Messles, a Yiddish language account of a day in the life of a man who was starving to death, written by an author who ultimately died of hunger. For those of us who mostly encounter Holocaust narratives in the form of survivor testimonies, Golden's piece is poignant and shocking. Golden compares his previous life as a leftist intellectual to his current existence as someone who is completely governed by his hungry belly. He writes, Maybe it isn't nice to think about oneself in this way, only about oneself. Oneself. Remember once, preached 1,000 times. The century of the masses, of the collective, the individual is nothing. Phrases. It's not me thinking, it's my stomach. It doesn't think, it yells. It's enough to kill you. It demands, it provokes me. Intellectual, where are you with your theories, your intellectual interests, your dreams, your goals? You educated imbecile. Answer me. Remember, every nuance, every twist of intellectual life used to enchant you, entirely possess you. And now? And now? Why are you telling like that? Because I want to, because I, your stomach, am hungry. Do you realize that by now? Golden does not explicitly mention reading Yiddish literature in this piece, but other writers, such as Avram Sutzkever, wrote about the importance of Yiddish and Yiddish literature. Before the war, Sutzkever was a member of the Lithuanian Yiddish modernist literary group Young Vilna. During the war, he was interned in the Vilna ghetto, where he continued to write poetry and was part of the Paper Brigade, a clandestine effort to smuggle and hide Jewish books and other cultural treasures, before he escaped from the ghetto and became a partisan. Post-war, Sutzkever testified as a witness in the Nuremberg trials using the Yiddish language, even though Yiddish was not an official language of the proceedings. And he moved to Israel, where for many years he edited the most prominent post-war Yiddish literary journal, Die Goldene Kate. I'd like to share an excerpt from his heartbreaking poem, Die Lehrerin Mira, Teacher Mira, which is a tribute to Mira Bernstein, who organized the schools in the Vilna ghetto. Sutzkever describes in rhymed couplets Mira's commitment to teaching the children classics of Yiddish literature, such as the work of Sholem Aleichem, the author who penned the stories that inspired the musical Fiddler on the Roof. Each day, Mira counts her pupils and grimly notes how many of them are now missing, how many of them have been killed during the night. I'll read you 3 stanzas in Yiddish and then in English translation. Me jogt über Chorvas on Bräut und on Feier. Das Bräut is a Buch und das Licht is a Bleier. Versammelt die Kinder in Chorve Dira. Es lernt sie weiter, die Lehrerin Mira. Sie lernt sie Sholem Aleichems a Meise. Es winkeln die Kinder und lachen bis Meise. Sie fleckt sie mit bläuenke Stenges die Zeppler und zählt ihr Vermög 130 die Kepler. Zugleich mit der Sonne ist die Lehrerin Mira schon wach und sie wart auf die Kinderlech ihre. Sie kommen, sie zählt, oh, nicht zählen sie besser. Durch Nacht hat du 20 verschnitten am Messer. They chase over ruins, no bread, no light. Bread is a book, a pencil shines so bright. She gathers all her children on the floor. Teacher Mira goes on teaching, as before. She reads Sholem Aleichem's tale aloud. A sparkle in their eyes, they laugh so proud. She ties blue ribbons in the girl's braids and counts her treasures, 130 heads. And Teacher Mira, like the sun at dawn, awakes, waits for her children to go on. They come, she counts, oh, better not to count. For overnight, some 20 were cut down. Many texts about the Holocaust address the fates of children, whether these pieces were written in Yiddish or in other languages. There is something so universal and so tragic about children who are caught up in political circumstances beyond their control, a fact that we have cruelly been reminded of today in the context of contemporary wars and violence that have not spared children. The last text I'd like to discuss is a play I'm currently translating, a work which addresses the experiences of children in wartime. My translation of Thea Artaszewska's play Miriamol comes out of a larger project on Yiddish plays by women. Back in 2019, when I became interested in the topic, there were no published English translations of Yiddish plays by female playwrights, and I decided to translate one myself. And now we do have a handful of published translations, thankfully. I wanted to translate a play that was critically acclaimed and wasn't just interesting because of the biography of the person who wrote it. But as it happens, Artaszewska was a fascinating figure, and her rich artistic life undoubtedly contributed depth to her play. Thea Artaszewska was born to an illustrious Hasidic family in Poland and became one of the few women to frequent I.L. Peretz's celebrated literary salon. Artaszewska was a dazzling figure in early 20th century Warsaw, in the early 20th century Yiddish cultural scene in Warsaw. She was an actress, artist's model, founder of the Azazel theater troupe, purported muse to I.L. Peretz, arts patron, and solonier. During World War II, Artaszewska lived in Warsaw with Aryan papers and was interned as a Polish citizen in the transit camp Borgweide and the concentration camp Gross Rosen. Her brothers perished in the Holocaust. After the war, she moved to Paris, where her sisters had survived. In 1954, her play Miriamol won an I.L. Peretz Prize for Best Yiddish Drama from the Congress for Jewish Culture, even though the play was in manuscript form. She first published Miriamol in 1958 in Canada, and then 1 year later in 1959 in Paris. Artaszewska died in Paris from a heart attack in 1962. So today, most people are unlikely to have heard of Artaszewska, even if they are well-versed in Yiddish literature, in part because scholarly awareness of Yiddish plays by women has lagged behind feminist scholarship of other literary genres. But in its own time, Miriamol was recognized by the arbiters of Yiddish literary taste as a significant Yiddish play with literary ambitions and virtuosity that rivaled other better-known modernist dramas. Historian Jacob Schatzky likened Artaszewska's work to that of well-known modernist playwrights, finding in Miriamol the unspoken suggestion of Maeterlinck, Peretz's impressionism, the poetic melancholy of Wyspiański's rhyme and rhythm. The significance of this play went beyond its artistry alone. Inspired by the pogroms that followed World War I and completed with intimate knowledge of the Holocaust, Miriamol presents a Yiddish world in shambles. Unlike her mentor Peretz's celebrated drama, Die Goldene Kette, The Golden Chain, which recounts the decline of an elite family, Artaszewska focuses on society's most vulnerable: orphans, refugees fleeing persecution, a pregnant rape survivor, the disabled. More profoundly doomed in a physical sense than the members of Peretz's Hasidic court in Die Goldene Kette, Artaszewska's characters nonetheless recall Jewish traditions and beliefs with pious devotion, almost as if the playwright was using this Yiddish drama to keep their memory alive. If redemption is possible at the end of this grim, complex, and touching dramatization of the plight of children in wartime, it does not come from religious leadership, philanthropy, nationalism, or state power. Instead, redemption comes from the Yiddish word itself. In this, Artsishevska demonstrates her continued commitment to the spirit of the Yiddish cultural milieu of her youth. She identifies herself, moreover, as an important literary heir to Peretz, who responds to tumultuous events that shook the Yiddish world to the core. Miriamol is a Yiddish language dramatic cycle in 15 scenes from the perspective of Hasidic children who make sense of their harsh new reality through games and stories about Rebbe's. This epic drama follows a group of children and the adults accompanying them from a presumably Ukrainian shtetl where they experience a pogrom, to their life as refugees, traveling between towns and hiding in cellars, to Warsaw, and then to a mystical realm, as Miriamol, initially described as a mentally ill adolescent orphan, takes on a more prophetic role, and finally leads the children from Warsaw towards, she claims, Jerusalem. Miriamol, whose name recalls the biblical prophetess Miriam, often disturbs the other children with her morbid comments, which are frequently delivered in rhyme. Artsishevska's Miriamol takes place in a Jewish victim-centered world where the central characters confront unnamed persecutors. Throughout the play, the children cope by playing games about the lives they have left behind and what they have experienced. Miriamol is one of the most extraordinary characters I have encountered in Yiddish literature. In the list of characters in the 1958 edition, her tragic circumstances are described with brutal efficiency. And I quote, mentally ill, 13 to 14 years old, daughter of a judge in a religious court, orphan, end quote. These attributes suggest a very difficult life. Normally, a female orphan with a mental illness would be viewed as a marginal figure in East European Jewish society, as Natan Meir has discussed in his book, Stepchildren of the Shtetl. What is more, this play is set in the context of pogroms and the Holocaust, when perpetrators considered such individuals, especially if they were Jewish, to be expendable. Yet Miriamol is at the very center of Artsishevska's magnum opus. Her madness is that of a holy fool or a prophet, and her suffering symbolizes the pain of European Jewish children in some of the grimmest moments of the 20th century. Depending on her mood, she is wise, tender, biting, poignant, fearful, or prophetic in turn, and her speech can sound like incantations or like some of the most haunting modernist dramas. While most Yiddish play translations are of texts written in the heyday of Yiddish theater from the late 19th to the early 20th centuries, Miriamol is a post-war work that juxtaposes Jewish folklore with modernist motifs. Although children do appear in plays about the Holocaust, like The Diary of Anne Frank and Leopoldstadt, it is unusual for a text about the Holocaust to highlight the experience of a female adolescent with a mental illness. Another surprising feature of the play is that it is very vague about who precisely is persecuting the children and why they need to hide in cellars for large portions of the play. Although it is not always obvious from the text how directly Artsishevska wanted to address the Holocaust, a number of her colleagues interpreted the play in this context. With regards to its modernism, topic, and critical acclaim, Miriamol challenges our expectations of Yiddish dramas and post-Holocaust literature. Artsishevska wrote Miriamol over the course of several tumultuous decades, beginning the play in 1920s Warsaw and completing it in 1950s Paris. Most of what I've been able to find out about her process of creation comes from the writings of her male contemporaries. They provide theories as to when the play was set and offer up interpretations about how we might situate Miriamol as a memorial work. In his 1962 obituary of Artsishevska in the Vorwärts, Leon Lennemann described the changing historical context of Miriamol. He focuses on how Artsishevska depicted the impact of recent traumas on Polish Jewish children. Initially, according to Lennemann, this trauma meant pogroms, since he wrote that the play was originally conceived as an elegy to the Jewish children who were killed in the pogroms at the end of World War I. Yet by the time Artsishevska completed the play and published it, Lenneman understood Miriamo as a work which depicted the Holocaust. He wrote, "Many years passed, and when Thea Artsishevska returned to the elegy and completed it, the tragedy of the Jewish child had already developed in terrifying ways. And the long poem also developed until it became Miriamo, the dramatic poem that laments with such power and at the same time with such gentle sensitivity the tragedy of the million exterminated Jewish children." End quote. While Artsishevska is vague about when the play is set, in a speech in scene 7, Miriamo prophesies a vast number of funerals, declaring a million, another a million, again a million, and a million again, a million funerals, end quote. The total number of funerals she predicts is 6 million, a number equal to the rounded estimate of Jews killed in the Holocaust. This number suggests that Artsishevska also viewed her play in connection with the Holocaust. It seems plausible that the play is set around 1918, but foreshadows the Holocaust. The text may also illustrate the way in which these historical events were not experienced as separate moments of violence, but bled into one another as one horrific historical epoch that devastated Eastern European Jewish communities. Artsishevska's play devotes its full attention to the victim's perspective, since Miriamo focuses on children who are aware of their own experiences but have little knowledge of the larger political or historical context. The perpetrators never appear on stage, their motives are never fully explained, and their identity is never specified. The fact of these unnamed persecutors invites a more universal interpretation of the play as a work about children during wartime and obscures the precise historical moment in question, even if the culture and rituals of the Jewish characters are clearly demarcated. The result ultimately is a work that is both deeply invested in traditional Jewish beliefs and skeptical about the possibility of any safe haven outside of the Yiddish word itself. Artsishevska's attitude comports with the impassioned Yiddish cultural activism of her youthful milieu, as well as with Jan Schwartz's characterization of post-Holocaust Yiddish writers as, quote, portable archives and encyclopedias of Ashkenazi culture in exile in their new homes, who made the Yiddish language their lifeline to the 600-year-old Ashkenazi civilization after the complete destruction of its material and social infrastructure, end quote. In Artsishevska's final scene, Miriamo stands in a mystical realm, alone except for Sholem, the rabbi's son, and points at the sun, itself a symbol of life, light, and sight. The play ends with an almost untranslatable phrase, since Miriamo declares that in the sun is a yud, the smallest Hebrew letter, the first letter in both the word Yiddish and the ineffable name of God, which in Artsishevska's dialect would sound like the word Yid, a Jew. The only hope or redemption is in this tiny Hebrew letter, which you see here in the sun, a choice recalling the concept of the Pintele Yid, a Jewish essence. Like Miriamo, Artsishevska clings to this letter, the spark of Jewishness, both the culmination of her magnum opus and the realization of her life's work. To conclude, this year's theme for Holocaust Memorial Day is For a Better Future. This is a very hopeful theme, and I'd like to conclude my talk today by talking about a better Yiddish future. To be clear, this is when I encourage you to incorporate some Yiddish into your life this year. If the Holocaust was about silencing and exterminating people whom the Nazis considered subhuman, then we can take a stand against Nazism by championing the language and culture of the 5 million murdered Yiddish speakers. The number of Yiddish speakers worldwide today is only a fraction of the pre-war numbers. But according to some figures, the numbers are growing because the communities that tend to pass Yiddish on to the next generation also tend to have lots of children. UCL is one of the leading places for the study of contemporary Hasidic Yiddish linguistics, thanks to the efforts of Lily Kahn and her colleagues. I have certainly learned a lot from my colleagues about the way Yiddish functions as a living language in places such as Stamford Hill, Williamsburg, Mea Shearim, and Antwerp. And I'm very pleased that UCL is taking such an active role in building bridges with Yiddish speakers who grew up in these communities. That being said, most of the Yiddish resources I'm going to share are designed for people who didn't grow up speaking Yiddish. There are lots of ways to engage with Yiddish in London or further afield, regardless of background, and many don't require you to know Yiddish yet. Take a Yiddish class, whether it is through UCL's Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies or through various summer schools and other institutions. Right now, there is a real flourishing of Yiddish academic scholarship and Yiddish translation, and you can find out more by going to the online Yiddish journal, In Geweb, a journal of Yiddish studies, or the Yiddish Book Center website. You also don't have to make the commitment to be a Yiddish scholar or fluent speaker. Go to a klezmer music concert or festival, such as Klez North or the JMI summer schools at SOAS. Attend a Yiddish open mic through the Yiddish Cafe Trust. English translations are provided, and many of the sessions are on Zoom if you can't make it to London. Participate in the Great Yiddish Parade and march through the streets of London while singing Yiddish labor songs. My department hosts various talks on Yiddish topics, like a lecture next month by Yiddish literature scholar Anita Norwich. I'm part of an effort to create a Yiddish theater troupe in London, and you can also hop on the Eurostar to see Yiddish theater performances in Paris. You can attend Yiddish culture festivals and summer language programs in places like Germany, Poland, New York, and Canada. Not to mention the fact that Yiddish is an official minority language in Sweden. In other words, there's so much to learn and experience when it comes to Yiddish, and yes, you might find yourself thinking about the Holocaust at unexpected times, but as I tell my students, the Yiddishist world is intimate enough that if you want to get involved, it is possible to create a niche for yourself. There's a lot of important and interesting work to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for a really moving, powerful, and inspiring talk. We are shkoyach, Hashem dank. We're now going to go over to the Q&A portion of the session. So our first question, which comes from Neil, is, was much Yiddish literature written in the ghettos and camps, and has much survived? If so, is there a resource where it can be found?
So, thank you for this question. There's a surprising amount that has survived, particularly through places such as the Oyneg Shabbos archive. And I would suggest there's several anthologies, such as Literature of Destruction, which was edited by David Roskies, which has texts from the ghettos and even from Auschwitz, as well as other Jewish texts that are responding to catastrophe. And David Roskies and Samuel Kassow, who has written a study of the Oyneg Shabbos archive, have also been involved in editing some more recent anthologies. And just this year, Kassow received a National Jewish Book Award for his translation of some texts that were written by Rachel Auerbach, who was a member of the Oyneg Shabbos archive.
Thanks, Sonia. The next question is, do you think, the two linked questions by Maud Warrett from UCL, do you think that learning to speak and write Yiddish could be seen as a political act to commemorate and also to honor the victims of the Holocaust? And should there be a Yiddish GCSE to encourage the learning and speaking of this language? I mean, I would already say yes to that second one. There should be a Yiddish GCSE, but go on, Sonia.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to have people do whatever whatever motivations people have for learning Yiddish. Um, for the most part, is great. And I support all efforts to encourage people to learn Yiddish. In Sweden, there's an initiative currently to train Yiddish teachers for school pupils, and I think that should be expanded to other countries if possible. So yes, certainly I think one motivation that people might have for studying Yiddish has to do with this sort of pushback against the destruction in the Holocaust, but there are also many other motivations people have, whether they're interested in the history or the linguistics, or if they have some sort of personal connection, or if they're interested in the religious life, or if they're interested in the radical politics. There's a lot of different motivations people have.
Thanks. Next question is from Anonymous. Really powerful and fascinating lecture. What happened to Yiddish writing after the Holocaust? Is new literature and theater still produced at all?
Yes, well, thank you first of all for the kind words. But yes, there is new Yiddish literature and theater that is being created. So as I mentioned, my research currently has to do with Yiddish plays by women, and recently there was a play called Die Freuen that was performed at the Yiddish Book Center, I believe. Certainly that you can learn about it from the Schmooze podcast by the Yiddish Book Center, but it's a play about it's an adaptation of Naomi Reagan piece, I think called The Women's Room, that's about a group of Hasidic women. So it's very contemporary, and it uses contemporary Hasidic Yiddish. So you do have, and also, for instance, at Oxford, the Yiddish lector, Eka Wiegand, is a Yiddish poet. So we do have some contemporary examples of Yiddish that are being created today.
Thanks. Okay, so our next question is, could you give a recommendation of a Yiddish text to include in a Holocaust Memorial Day event?
Yes, that's a great question. And so one of the most common pieces to use is actually a song, Zog nicht keinmal. So it's like, never say that you go the final way, the Partisans Hymn. And this was written by Hersch Glick, and it's sort of like a march that's proclaiming that proclaiming this resilience and resistance. So often at Holocaust Memorial Day events, that might be the Yiddish text that's included. Maybe that might be performed at the end.
Thanks. Then we have a question about the transmission of Yiddish. Why did people in Western Europe not pass Yiddish on to their kids, and why did those in Eastern Europe do so?
Excellent questions. This has to do with the history of Jewish emancipation. So starting in the late 18th century, so like in 1780 with the Edict of Tolerance in the Habsburg Empire, Jews start receiving more civil rights, but it's often civil rights for Jews as individuals, but that doesn't mean that traditional Jewish communities are necessarily being tolerated. So like Napoleon said that basically everything for the Jews as individuals and nothing for Jews as a community. So there was this expectation that in exchange for having more social acceptance and more opportunities, that Jews would be expected to become Austrian or French or German or British, and that they might give up some of their own particularities, that they might dress like their neighbors, that they might write their documents in the state language instead of in their own particular cultures. And so that's something that happened earlier in Western Europe. And so that also meant that there was more both a carrot and a stick, like encouragement and also some pushing to get Jews to participate more in the majority culture and to embrace these opportunities. And that was just more available earlier in Western Europe.
Thanks, Sonia. Another question. How much interest is there among the Yiddish-speaking Hasidim in the secular culture, and what role could or do they have in the project of preservation and revival? That's a big topic.
It's a big topic, and I think you would also be very, well, not that you weren't qualified to answer any of these other questions, but I think that's particularly in your area of expertise. I think some of it varies, and it also depends on particular individuals. But one thing that I particularly enjoy is like seeing when there's like musical influence. I'm a dance scholar, and I do a lot that has to do with performance culture, and so sometimes you'll get examples of songs. Like, for instance, there was this this European pop song, Genghis Khan in German, that's that then gets sort of then gets this Yiddish version that is no longer called Genghis Khan. It's called Eden, so Jews, and that it has this whole Yiddish Orthodox afterlife. So there are situations certainly where communities might be policing some of the cultural borders, trying to preserve their own particularity, which is something that actually is great for preserving a minority language. But on the other hand, sometimes there are different ways in which there might be broader influence. You also definitely see that linguistically. And again, this is your expertise, but there's some very interesting linguistic innovations that have to do with influence from the majority languages, and some of the ways in which, when I talk to friends that grew up in as Hasidic Yiddish speakers, they're like less invested than like I might be in trying to use vocabulary that might have more, I guess you could say, like traditional Yiddish roots, that they might be a bit more, speaking to them, it can be much more relaxed about including English terminology, for instance.
Thanks. Just a couple of more questions. Maud Warrett said, I'm thankful for this lecture. I found it very moving and enlightening. One more question. Is Yiddish taught in Germany at the moment?
Yes, Yiddish is taught in Germany at the moment. And actually, I spent the year after I finished university, my bachelor's degree at Heinrich Heine University in Düsseldorf, with Professor Marian Aptrud, and in their Yiddish studies program, which continues to this day. Marian also co-wrote a Yiddish textbook that's designed for German speakers, which I love. And in Germany, so you can study Yiddish at German universities such as in Düsseldorf or Trier or Potsdam. And also there is a very exciting sort of klezmer performance culture scene there. So you get, for instance, Yiddish Summer Weimar, which is in Weimar, Germany, the home or associated with Goethe and Schiller, and also with the Weimar Republic. And also it is a particularly great place in the summer to learn about klezmer music or Yiddish folk song. And then you also get the Städtelneukölln festival in Berlin, and it's a Berlin Yiddish summer program. So I'm a great fan of the Yiddish developments in Germany.
And final question from the audience. Bit of a fun question, says Daniel Javed. Do you have any favorite Yiddish rappers?
Well,
it was a bit out of left field.
Yeah, and so in terms of hip hop artists, which is not exactly the same, but I think he does use rap. My friend Josh Dolgan, who performs under the name So Called, he's based in Montreal, is he's great, and he also like mixes between some of these like old time Yiddish recordings, and also like uses like hip hop. So I actually play some of his songs in class. So like one of my my favorite albums is it's called the Hip Hop Chasana. Chasana is the Yiddish word for wedding. And so basically it goes through the different components of a traditional Jewish wedding and makes this like Yiddishy hip hop song for each of these different elements. And so like when I'm teaching about Barcones, which is the sort of like the wedding MC entertainer wedding gesture, who had like this particular type of singing that was like addressing the bride and like basically supposed to tell her about all of these how her life would be so sad, and then she would break into cathartic tears, and then everybody could get this sort of emotional release and go back to celebrating. There's a sort of mix between like having these like moments of sadness, possibly reminders of the destruction of the first and second temple, and then you have the joy. So there's this emotional mixing, which is very interesting. And so if I want to tell students about the nature of barjones, the nature of this sort of singing that is performed, then it's a nice addition to be able to include this hip hop song.
Thanks, Sonia. That is the end of the questions. So I just want to thank you again for a really, really excellent, very thought-provoking, profound, and appropriate for Holocaust Memorial Day topic, but that is also very uplifting. And I just wanted to add at the end to all of the places that you mentioned where one can start engaging with Yiddish, that if anyone would like to come study Yiddish, you're very welcome to join us in the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies for Yiddish classes. And some of us also teach on a summer school in London. It's only 1 week. It's called Ota Zoy, run by the Jewish Music Institute in August. So if you have a week and you'd like to learn some Yiddish, yeah, you're very welcome to get in touch with us if you want any more details about that. So thanks again, Sonia. I really appreciate how you linked Yiddish to the Holocaust and Holocaust Memorial Day, because it's often an overlooked aspect of the Holocaust. And thanks to everyone for joining the session. It's been really lovely having you here. And we're very grateful for all of you for your participation. So thanks a lot. A schönen Dank, Sonia, und a schönen Dank, Alamin.